by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all sitting right now all around Australia, and acknowledge that the process of reconciliation is far from complete, and there's so much work to do. So thanks so much, Rhonda, Nicola and Beck, because you've done an amazing job putting together this webinar series, and looking at the number of registrations, it just shows how much interest there is. So I really pay tribute to the efforts that you've made to put this all together. In terms of who's putting this together, many of you will be familiar with the Centre for Social Impact, but we're a national organisation comprising research centres at 3 universities. So there's Swinburne University of Technology, where I'm from, in Melbourne, the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and the University of Western Australia in Perth. And the Centre for Social Impact, or CSI, focuses on teaching and research into the social purpose sector and social innovation. So my name's Krystian Seibert, and I'll be your moderator. I'm an industry fellow, which is a fancy name for an academic that doesn't have a PhD. And I'm based at the Centre for Social Impact in Melbourne at Swinburne University, where I do research on philanthropy and the NFP sector, and also teach into our graduate certificate and Masters of Social Impact, including our 2 units specifically focused on philanthropy. I'm also a policy advisor to Philanthropy Australia, where I used to work for over 4 years. So today is a panel discussion, and I've moderated plenty of panel discussions in the past, but none online through Zoom. So hopefully my computer won't explode or anything like that, but hopefully it'll all work smoothly. And the topic is philanthropy in the context of COVID-19. And we have 3 awesome panelists joining us today. Unfortunately, our 4th panelist that was going to be with us, Sarah Wickham, the Policy and Research Manager at Philanthropy Australia, is sick, and we do hope that she rests up and gets better soon. So we have Sarah Davies, the CEO of Philanthropy Australia. We have Lisa George, the Global Head of the Macquarie Group Foundation based in Singapore, and Maree Sidey, the CEO of the Australian Communities Foundation. Now, in terms of what we're going to focus on, I don't want to talk for too much longer, but I don't need to tell you that this crisis is having a major impact on the NFP sector and the communities it serves. It's turned Australia upside down, and it's having a dramatic impact on the NFP sector and the communities that it serves. So this discussion is about exploring how philanthropy is responding to support the NFP sector and support those communities. Just a bit of background on philanthropy's role in the sector. In 2017, based on ACNC data, charities in Australia had an income of $146 billion. About $10 billion of that came from giving, and around 1.5 billion came from structured philanthropy, trusts and foundations, etc. So it may be a small proportion of income, but it's still important. Now, we've recently seen analysis by John McLeod of JB Weir, which was released last week, estimating that total giving will fall by around 7.1% in 2020, after rising by about 5% over the previous 2 years. But next year in 2021, giving is estimated to fall by a further 11.9%, back to levels not seen since 2012. Now, I don't need to say that that's not great news, and that'll have a big impact. So we're here today to discuss how philanthropy is responding to the crisis, how it can respond going forward, what policy settings are needed, and what other changes and support is needed in order to enhance philanthropy's response, and what does the not-for-profit sector need from philanthropy as well. So that's the introduction. And I thought I'll first turn to Sarah Davies from Philanthropy Australia and ask you, Sarah, what your general impressions are about how the crisis is impacting philanthropy in Australia, but also overseas, and what some of the overall shifts are that you're seeing.
Thanks, Krystian. Hi, everybody. Look, I do apologise. I live on a train line, so if there's a bit of background noise, it's because they're chuffing past. We've actually seen, I think, a very fast and generous response from Australian Philanthropics in relation to COVID-19. We've currently got a survey out with a number of our grant-making members. It's only been out for a couple of days, but I did have a quick look last night in terms of what people are telling us, and we had about 35 trusts and foundations respond. So 90% of them have pivoted and changed their grant making approach, particularly in response to this period. And of that 90% who've changed, 80 of them have released flexibility around their reporting requirements, administrative requirements. Half of them have shifted their grants to untied and unrestricted grants, so grants that are already made. They've gone to those organisations and said, look, use this for what you need. About half of them have offered additional grant resources and made additional funding available. So we've seen a really quick and very generous, I think, change. And of those, the 10% that hadn't already changed their response, a third of them are planning to do so, and the pattern's very similar. A third of them are offering grants to new grant recipients. So it's not just about staying with the relationships that they've got. That is the majority of what we're hearing, though. We're hearing that trusts and foundations are really doubling down with their existing partners. And not just offering to be more flexible and to untie the grants, but also offering additional resources. So I actually think the Australian response has been terrific. It's really fast, it's really generous, it's very thoughtful, it's very considered. And in fact, a number of our members have publicly committed to behaving in that kind of real leadership way and have signed a public pledge, which is available on our website to see. We had 45 major grant-making institutions sign on to that public pledge, making commitments in terms of how they support the charity sector. And a number actually of those who've signed on are on this webinar today. So Snow Foundation, Ross Trust, Macquarie, Australian Communities Foundation, Beeson Family Foundation, Give Where You Live. So I think we've seen really terrific leadership. And in terms of how that relates to overseas, we're in quite close touch with New Zealand, Canada, and the UK in particular, and it is very similar. There's been a similar response, information is shared. So I think that we are up there with, leading trusts and foundations around the world.
That's great. And so, Sarah, you've talked a bit about what Philanthropy Australia is doing. There's the statement, there's the survey, and you are engaging a lot with your members around how their practice is evolving during this time. And are there any other sort of priorities that Philanthropy Australia has at the moment in terms of how you're engaging with your members and others?
Yes, and look broadly into two clusters. So there are kind of the really pragmatic, practical things that we are trying to help our members with. And one of them was released a couple of weeks ago in partnership with Maree, who we'll hear from in a minute, and the Australian Communities Foundation, which is a national funding platform. So the Australian Communities Foundation had a donor portal that they have been running, and they've basically taken a portion of that. We've partnered with them, and so this is publicly available, and it's essentially a matching service between grant seekers who need support as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic crisis, and grant makers and donors who are looking to support. So you can find that on both our website and the Australian Communities Foundation website. If you're looking for a grant, it's very straightforward. You enter your details and your requirements, and if you're a donor looking to fund, then you can search by geography or by community served. So designed to be a very immediate, quick matching service. And there are a number of others of those sorts of really practical help resources that are available on our website. And then the second bucket of things is around the policy and advocacy work that we're doing to encourage more giving and to encourage the government, the Commonwealth in particular, to make sure that they understand and include the broad non-profit and charitable sector in their policy responses and their stimulus package, because we operate in quite a different way. And so a number of the provisions that have been announced just don't quite fit us. So we're working hard on making sure that you know, the policy environment is appropriate. And, you know, an example of a really great win was the halving of the loss threshold to qualify for JobKeeper allowance. And the announcements on Friday night, again, the definition of revenue for non-profits to make it much more feasible for the non-profit sector.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And I might turn to you, Maree, now, given that Sarah mentioned the funding portal. So as a community foundation, you have a grant pool that you grant sort of as untied funds, and then you have a number of sub funds as well, where you have a diverse group of donors that do philanthropy. So as a community foundation with that diverse model, what are you seeing, and what are some of the things that you're doing in response to the crisis?
Thanks, Krystian. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see so many friendly faces. I've been flipping through the gallery, and lovely to see so many people online. So for those who don't know what a community foundation is, it's essentially a collection of many donors. So we have about 1,000 donors who are part of the Australian Communities Foundation. And so we see ourselves as a little bit of a microcosm of the whole sector in terms of understanding trends in giving. And we support giving in two different ways. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what we've done with our donor community as a response to COVID. We've introduced two ways of giving. One is giving together, which is really important for community foundations. And we have two ways that our donor community can give together to respond to COVID at the moment. So we've just established a National Crisis Response Fund. And that's been really interesting to think about how we use that fund. And we've decided to focus it on vulnerable communities. So essentially, who are the communities that are falling through the cracks at the moment? How do we find them, and how do we support them, and what are the highest needs? So when we think about vulnerable communities at the moment, we're thinking about refugee and asylum seeker communities, people both inside and outside of detention, people with a disability, First Nations communities, and there's a lot of thoughtful grant making and partnerships right across the philanthropic sector happening, particularly with remote Indigenous communities. I think we're all really concerned about the potential impact of COVID on remote communities. Renters and low-income households, women particularly experiencing family violence, and we know that there's been a lot of discussion about that within the public domain. People experiencing homelessness, and people in and exiting prison. So they're the communities that we're really thinking through how we respond through the National Crisis Response Fund. So we're just making our first 3 grants from that fund. One is very specific supportive grant in partnership with NACCHO. So that's the National Organisation of Aboriginal Community Controlled Health organisations across the country. And they came to us and said, and a whole group of funders, and said we need about $100,000 to ensure that we have protective equipment and just even basic things like hand sanitizer. We're also doing some work with women exiting prison through the Law and Advocacy Centre for Women. So we know that women are potentially higher risk of going back to violent situations when they first emerge out of prison. And also not forgetting LGBTQI communities. So supporting frontline counsellors to make sure that they can continue their services. So that's just a snapshot from the National Crisis Response Fund. Interestingly, we also have a rapid advocacy fund that we've partnered with the Centre for Australian Progress to establish. And that's just giving small grants of 3 to 10K, but those small grants can be really effective at the moment. And that's for grassroots campaigning organisations. So things like renters' rights or the Unemployed Workers Union, or ensuring that we're looking at what's happening with over-policing at the moment and the potential for over-policing of minority communities. So there are 2 collective giving funds, and then just finally thinking and looking at what our donors as a whole are doing. We've given about $500,000 to COVID-19 projects in the last 2 months, and they've gone to sectors such as medical support, prevention, campaigning, legal support, protecting the arts, and we should come back to the arts because really important conversation at the moment about what's happening with arts and culture, vulnerable communities, which I've already mentioned, and mental health and homelessness. So that's a high-level snapshot of what we've been doing, as well as partnering around the funding portal. And as Sarah said, please do jump on and have a look at the funding portal. There are about 200 plus proposals on there at the moment, and we're seeing 2 types of proposals. One is from organisations adapting so that they can keep providing their key services. So how do people keep doing the important work that they've always been doing, but what do they need to change within their core services to keep functioning? And then the other type of proposal we're seeing is from organisations who are adapting to meet an emerging need. And we know that funders from right across the country are looking at the funding portal and using it to inform their grant making.
Thanks so much, Maree. And it's interesting the point you made about the funding for the nachos around protective equipment and sanitizer, because we've seen in the United States that philanthropy is funding many things that we would think of as core services, personal protective equipment, etc. And we think in Australia that, we've had a better government response to the crisis, etc. But even there's that problem here that organisations that, receive government funding and, that should cover these sorts of things, they don't have enough of that government funding to provide personal protective equipment for their services, and they're relying on philanthropy to provide that essential protection for their staff and those whom they serve. So that's a really interesting example.
Yeah, and I think really important reminder of that tension that always exists in philanthropy between getting money out of the door quickly and responding to need. And being really clear that we're across what the need is in the community at the moment. And then also, as Sarah said, sticking in there with the organisations that we've been supporting for a long time and reducing red tape to make sure that we're being as responsive and as supportive as possible.
And Lisa, I'll turn to you now. You're the head of a global corporate foundation, so quite a different philanthropic organisation. Would you be able to share sort of your perspective on what you've been seeing and what the Macquarie Group Foundation is doing in response to this crisis, both in Australia but also what you're seeing globally?
Yeah, thanks, Krystian. So a lot of what Sarah and Maree mentioned really resonate. For me and for what we've been thinking about. So we really did 4 things, so far done 4 things in response to the crisis. So the first thing, we've obviously, we're, as you say, a global company. So, we've been feeling the effects of COVID-19 since January, when it hit our China, Hong Kong offices and our people, and, really started to see the wave that came to Singapore, and it's come back again in a way here in Singapore. So really quickly, we went out to our grant partners, so these that we support, and said, first of all, you can count on our support. That's a given, but please let us know what you need in terms of flexibility, all the things that Sarah mentioned that were in the pledge, converting grants into operating support where required. Some of them are still, frankly, working. It's such an ever-changing, evolving situation. But putting the offer out there and saying we're here for whatever you need, so please reach out. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, showing our support to the sector at large. So signing on to those philanthropic statements. So not just Philanthropy Australia, the London Funders Network put one out similarly as well, and we signed that onto that as well. And we're looking at one in another market as well. So really, wherever there are groups, philanthropists coming together to say we stand with the sector, these are the principles that we commit to adopting. We were really keen to sign up to that, not just as a way to show our solidarity for the nonprofits that we fund, but really, I think, to encourage other funders to think in the same way. Thirdly, of course, I think people would have seen we announced, Macquarie announced a $20 million commitment to COVID-19 relief efforts, which is a really significant commitment. And, you know, given different communities are experiencing this at different rates, we're trying to be as responsive as possible. And, you know, what Maree said exactly about balancing the need to get money out the door quickly and assessing the needs appropriately. In the near term, we're focused on direct relief efforts, and then saving quite a large portion of that to focus on economic recovery in our key markets. And then finally, because with our large fund, we are thinking about scale and reach of impact and how we can kind of have the biggest impact with those funds. We did announce an internal fund, a $1 million internal fund for nonprofits that our staff were significantly involved in. So that's in addition to the 20 million, really for small grassroots organizations. So focused on the ones that are struggling at this time, the ones that are really meeting the immediate needs in our markets all around the world. We're in 31 markets around the world. So we wanted to balance the scale and the large reach with also the grassroots as well. So that's things that what we've done, and it all sounds very seamless, but a lot of challenges along the way.
Thanks so much, Lisa. There's some really interesting insights, and you make the point about some of the challenges. So, Sarah, Maree, Lisa, I'd be interested in your perspective about what some of the challenges you see for philanthropic organisations, but also turning the table somewhat. What some of the challenges you see for grantee partners in the not-for-profit sector engaging with philanthropy at this time. So maybe, Sarah, I'll sort of turn to you first on that.
Sure. So, one of the challenges for philanthropic providers is the corresponding economic volatility and the hit then to the value of the capital and the corpus that is the engine in many of them that drives the distribution of the grants. So we have tried to suss out with our members how they're thinking and feeling about that. And I must stress this is only 2 days worth of data. We'll give it a week and a half and we'll have some proper data. But for this year, at least half of our members are saying that their distribution levels will remain the same. So Krystian, you quoted John McLeod and Davies' research that was released last week saying that overall giving is likely to be down by about 7% this year. What we're seeing from our structured giving members is that at least half of them are planning to maintain their giving levels, and about 40% of them actually said they were going to increase their giving. So it's a very small minority who are going to be adjusting the distributions this financial year to take that into account. We asked them what they were thinking about next year, and unsurprisingly, most of them said we haven't thought about it yet because there's kind of a lot on our plate at the moment. But roughly, those that did say that they thought about it, a quarter of them were saying that they probably will decrease their giving because their corpus will be lower, and as we know, particularly for ancillary funds, the distribution amount is calculated as a percentage of the value of the assets. But a quarter of them are saying that they're going to keep them the same, and 10% are saying that they are going to try and increase. So, you know, the challenge for philanthropy is, in a giving sense, if your engine is smaller and your engine drives the distributions, how can we maintain and or increase distributions when the engine is getting smaller? So that comes to a second challenge or opportunity, depending on what way you want to look at it. I prefer the latter. Around, well, what other ways are there to get working capital into non-profits? And a bit later, when I talk about some of our policy initiatives, I'll talk a bit about some of the work we're doing to try and generate more working capital into the non-profit sector that perhaps can come from philanthropy balance sheets or philanthropy using their balance sheets increasingly in more innovative and different ways that kind of get liquidity into non-profits.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I think that we're overwhelming Zoom because we've got over 270 participants, and so could everyone except the panelists just turn their videos off, because that might relieve some of the pressure on Zoom and improve the connection. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. you touched on some really interesting challenges, Sarah, and I think that, yeah, you've got the situation where the need has increased, but the engine room, because the assets of foundations generally are invested in the market, and the share market has collapsed, etc. You know, there's that tension between, especially for foundations that want to exist in perpetuity, sort of getting the money out, increasing their granting because of that increased need, but, you know, managing the fact that, you know, the value of their assets has gone down. And I did see a comment from someone about accessing those statistics that Sarah mentioned. I think we will make them publicly available at some stage, Sarah, will
Yeah,
we?
absolutely. The survey's only been out with our members for a couple of working days. I just had a quick sneak peek last night at the early bird responses. But give us sort of a week and a half, 2 weeks, and we'll collect the information properly, and of course we'll then share it with everybody.
Yeah. And I'm sorry about the internet connection. There's not that much that we can do about it, but we'll persevere. Maree, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing from your perspective as a community foundation?
Yeah, thanks, Krystian. Look, I'd like to echo what Sarah said, but I won't repeat that. Clearly, there are a myriad of challenges that foundations are experiencing at the moment in terms of being in the middle of many of the fundraising organisations themselves, as well as grant makers. So there's that double squeeze. I think the things that that came to mind that I thought were worth mentioning around challenges and opportunities were really thinking about the partnerships and public conversations that we've been having about. There are emerging opportunities, I think, to be thinking about the kind of Australia that we're wanting to emerge out of post-COVID-19. And we are seeing some really exciting opportunities to shift conversations in some really, with some really, what up until now have been quite intractable issues. And they're things like reimagining childcare and unpaid labour. I mean, we've just got this really exciting opportunity over the next 12, 18 months to be rethinking about, you know, suddenly we have access to free childcare, and what does that mean for parents across the country, and how do we want to think about whether we can sustain that type of approach going forward. We also have the really interesting thing that's happening in Australia at the moment, where so many people suddenly have an experience of welfare reform that they've never had before, which means that we have this really exciting opportunity to have a discussion about what does the safety net in Australia look like now that we've suddenly have thousands of people thinking, you know, realising that it's not the others over there who were in need of the safety net, but suddenly it's us, it's our families, it's our friends. And then the other thing that came to mind was the debate about renewable energies, which has also been really hard to progress. But suddenly at this point in time, there seems to be space for that. So they're the sort of opportunities. And then I think the challenges working on that same theme are making sure that the areas that we were focusing on and feeling like we were making some progress on don't get lost at the moment. So things like the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the conversation around treaty. You know, let's make sure that doesn't get sidelined because we're in a crisis, or climate change is a really obvious one, and one that's close to our heart as a community foundation is things about democracy and integrity and the accountability of government. And let's make sure that we're still keeping scrutiny on government and that legislation doesn't get pushed through that has a whole lot of unhelpful implications in a time of crisis. So that's where my head was going, Krystian.
No, there's some really interesting insights, Maree, and I think that, you know, in this sort of difficult time when many of us, including myself, can get down about things, there is that argument about we have an opportunity to sort of, you know, reshape society after what will probably be, you know, the biggest depression or recession since the 1930s. And I've actually got a piece in the Pro Bono News coming out on Thursday that actually makes that point. And you talk about how, yeah, very rightly, many people, you know, have not been on welfare before, whereas we've got, you know, hundreds of thousands of people on what's now called the job seeker payment, which is the New Start equivalent, not the job keeper payment, but the job seeker payment. And one of the first things the government did was actually double the rate of New Start to create the job seeker payment. And not-for-profits funded by Philanthropy have been campaigning to increase the rate of New Start by just $50 for years now. And the response from the government has been no, 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 no. And when we have a crisis, one of the first responses basically is to admit that the level is too low for a person to live on. And the government's doubled it. Now, whether it can stay at double the level is probably, optimistic, but it has shifted the debate in terms of, what is that, as you say, what is that safety net? What kind of a society do we want where people, when they lose their job or that sort of thing, the support that exists for them? And I think there's a real opportunity there for Philanthropy and the not-for-profit sector to partner to drive that shaping. So it's not a missed opportunity. And before I turn to you, Lisa, I think one of the sort of aspects of urgency there is I do remember when there was the global financial crisis, which was called the Great Recession. I think they'll have to rename it now because this one will be the Greater Recession. Not that it's good, but bigger. People said that society will change after the GFC, etc., but it didn't. Inequality actually got worse. Those sorts of things. So there is, an important, opportunity there. Lisa, what are some of the challenges that the Macquarie Group Foundation is seeing in terms of how you're rolling out your funding and opportunities as well?
So I think, when you see a number like 20 million, it sounds like a lot, but, as I said, we are operating globally. So I think the greatest challenge for us is the different considerations of our different markets and where they are in this crisis. Speaking of the safety net, I think you only have to look at the United States to see how appalling the situation is now as a result of so many people not having basic access, to healthcare even, let alone other parts of the safety net. So I think, that's something that we're really thinking about, is that's a really large market for us. So what does our response in the UK and the US look like? What does places like India look like? It's still very much unknown, a place where the level of testing is nowhere near what it is in more developed countries. The scale of the problem there is going to be huge, and we want to have a commensurate, response for India and other developments as well, where we have operations. So, balancing all of that has been a real challenge for us. Balancing, as I said, the speed of getting money out the door versus researching the key issues and conducting appropriate due diligence. We're just not running the same processes that we normally would. So we're not, calling for applications. What we're doing instead is speaking to experts, sector leaders, government officials around the world to really understand where the issues are, where we could make a difference, and the types of organizations we could fund. And I think, another challenge, certainly on the scientific side, as in particular, is sometimes experts, this is also new, an unprecedented crisis that sometimes it's hard to get, triangulate all the right information. Ways we're addressing this is we're just being, I think, as nimble as we possibly can. So where our foundation board would normally meet quarterly, our board is meeting every 2 to 3 weeks, really trying to be as responsive to the changing environment and the funding proposals that we're considering. Some of the decisions have been delegated to the chair and myself to kind of even speed up that process so that we're speaking on a daily basis. And as I said, reserving some of the fund for downstream impacts, because we know there's going to be a very long tail with this crisis, and we know that the need is going to change even more. I mean, in terms of opportunities, I think one great opportunity from all of this has been a fantastic collaboration between funders. So a lot of who I've been speaking to is other funders, people with different expertise, people, funders in Australia, funders globally, to find out how they're responding, the organizations they're speaking to, and finding ways that we can partner together as well, and not duplicate efforts. So I think that's been a real opportunity.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lisa. Now, Sarah and Maree, you both mentioned the arts, and the arts has had a lot of, is really under strain, and there has not really been an adequate response from the government at all in that space. So What are your comments in terms of what philanthropy's role is in the arts and culture space in response to the crisis? I might turn to you first, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Krystian. Look, just a couple of quick things to say. I mean, the first one, for those of you who don't live in Victoria, the Victorian government announced a really significant support package for the arts recently, both for arts organisations and also artists. So it was terrific to see that leadership and support come out from the Victorian government. Philanthropy Australia runs a number of peer network groups for its members, and one of the peer network groups, one of the strong peer network groups, is the Arts Funder Network. There are a number of members on this webinar. There is an initiative that the Sydney Myer Fund is leading with members of the Arts Funder Network to support artists. Now, unfortunately, I can't say too much about it because I've got a proposal going to my board meeting next week. Lisa, you're on my board. You can say yes, please, when this comes to you with the papers tomorrow. That will be, I hope, a collaborative response from a number of our very strong and committed arts funder grant makers to artists in the sector. So I don't want to be premature because it does have to go through our board next week. It is being led by the Sydney Myer Fund and has the support, as I say, of a number of significant arts donors in Australia. But again, watch our social media or watch out for our website. I think my board meeting's on the 6th, so assuming it goes through, there'll be an announcement later that day or on the 7th.
Awesome, thanks, Sarah. Some really interesting insights there. So watch this space. Maree, you had some comments that you wanted to make about arts and culture as well.
Yeah, look, I think they've been covered. I think my main point was making sure that in our focus on sort of a health and economic crisis, we're not forgetting about the arts. And I think it comes back to recognising that philanthropy is such a strong supporter of the arts. And this goes to the key message to philanthropy about support new and emerging issues, be responsive and be agile, but also keep supporting the organisations that you've always supported, because you're the lifeline to those organisations at the moment. And I think it also goes, Krystian, to the bigger worry and concern that we all have about how many of our not-for-profit organisations and charities will survive COVID-19, and will we have a really depleted third sector coming out of the end of this? And one of the key lookouts for philanthropy is just making sure that we are funding sustainability of as many organisations as possible, whether they be in arts and culture or whether they be in other sectors, to make sure that we retain a really thriving civil society.
No, thanks, Maree. And I encourage everybody to ask questions using the chat function. Rhonda is collating those questions for when we do questions in a moment. I did want to turn to one other area, and it did come up in the comments as well. And Lisa, you mentioned sort of how the situation, say, somewhere like India will be very different to Australia or America or Europe. And I did see an interesting table on Twitter from the World Economic Forum a few days ago, saying that this crisis could lead to a growing gap in inequality between sort of developed countries and developing countries, or it could exacerbate that gap. And I'd be interested sort of in your thoughts and the thoughts of the other panelists around sort of, global development in this context as well, and sort of the differences between certain countries, because I think, yeah, there is a possibility that, in turning to sort of focus on Australia, because we have a crisis here and we have an immense need, that we might not focus as much on sort of the need beyond our borders.
I'm not an economist, so I won't try to comment in any really intellectual way on global development and what might happen. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense intuitively. And I think, as I said, as a global foundation and present in 31 markets, many of which are, still very much developing, that has been a priority for us to really think about, how we can stop from who are already at the margins, really vulnerable people, living in extreme poverty, frankly just trying to feed themselves. So in India at the moment, the country in lockdown, so Prime Minister Modi has not allowed people to leave their homes at all. It's really getting food. That's the fundamental need for people in India. So I think it's in my mind, it's hard to sort of think at the macro level of what inequality will look like. You need to just save people from dying, from one day to the next with meeting needs. So that's kind of where we're focused on now. And as I said, we will, retain some of our funds to think about that economic recovery and what does that look like in those developing markets. I can't really say at this stage.
Okay, so watch this space really as well. And so we actually answered one of the questions, I think, which sort of touched on global development in that discussion. Sarah, I just want to turn back to you, and please, I encourage everybody to ask more questions in the chat function as well. Sarah, what are some of the policy measures, in a bit more detail, of some of the policy measures that Philanthropy Australia is engaging with the government about in terms of trying to support the not-for-profit sector and get philanthropy to increase giving?
Yeah, thanks, Krystian. And look, I might split these comments into two buckets. There are the policy measures that are clearly in our bailiwick, but then there are things that we're sticking our noses into that some might say we're swimming outside our lane, but we'll see. So in terms of within philanthropy, one of our key positions is to encourage the government not to change the minimum distribution requirements for ancillary funds. There have been sort of two choruses of voices into the government, both equally persuasive and both equally powerful in terms of the voices that are speaking. One chorus saying, look, this is everybody's rainy day. Philanthropic funds have been given away. The corpus no longer belongs to the individual. They are public charitable funds. They've received, in many instances, a tax deduction for the gift, and they certainly operate in a tax concession environment. So actually mandatorily then increase the distribution requirements because those funds need to go out into the community. The other chorus is saying, we've taken a hit to our capital. We have to be responsible and think about this long term. We therefore want to see a reduction in the minimum distribution requirements. And this isn't a question about right and wrong, because as always, everybody's a little bit right and everybody's a little bit wrong. Our position has been, don't change any of the minimum distribution requirements. The algorithm and the formula behind the distribution requirements have been set very specifically and for very good reasons, and they are sensible and clear, and just keep them the same. But actually, let's incentivize over distribution. So we have developed a proposition for the government that it is considering that says, look, keep the minimum distribution requirements the same, but what the behaviour that we want to see is actually increased distribution. So let's create a recognition or an incentive program that encourages ancillary funds to give more than they need to. We know that the government is considering that. I have no idea whether they'll go for it or not, but we're continuing to work with them on that. The other policy areas, though, are perhaps broader. One about general giving, which is actually how do we encourage everybody to give, not just structured giving. And so a number of us are collaborating to talk to the government about trying to increase the incentive for giving. So our proposal is that the government actually incentivises giving by offering 150% deductibility on donations to DGR organisations, both this financial year and next financial year, because I think, as is backed up by John McLeod and JB Weir data, it's actually the next financial year and possibly the one after that where the giving is probably going to be most hit. So if we can try and incentivise general giving in the next 18 months to 2 years, let's do that. And again, we're working with the government to look at that 150% deductibility. There are some discussions going on about who would be eligible, and we're having those discussions with the government. The two big sort of ongoing policy ideas, however, are really focused on how do we get more working capital into nonprofits, for two reasons. And when we actually started developing these policy ideas, At this point, we really only were focusing on how do we keep the lights on for non-profits during this period. And I know there's somebody on the webinar from Give Where You Live in Geelong, which is where this initiative, this idea grew. So, how do we actually create a pool of funds to support non-profits from now until when they can come out the other side of this that is just life support? And the proposition on that is a matching grant, flow-through grant pool where philanthropy would contribute and government would match it. So we have talked to government quite a bit about that. I will be honest, there doesn't seem to be huge excitement in government, the federal government, about that. But we are also talking to state governments, and the New South Wales state government in particular is pursuing that idea. Again, have no idea whether it will materialise, but they have been very responsive. And the second idea, or the second proposal that we are working on, and where there has been good interest, and we're continuing to flesh out how the mechanisms on how this would work, is a preferential loan program for non-profits, where the loan would be unsecured by the non-profit, so they wouldn't have to carry it on their balance sheet, they wouldn't have to put up assets to secure it, where the loss guarantee would be shared by philanthropy and the government. So what we're proposing is that collectively philanthropy takes the first loss, or it becomes guarantor for the first loss up to 5%, and government thereafter. So it's quite similar in one way to the SME loan provisions that the government announced as part of its economic stimulus package. But we've done quite a bit of research with nonprofits, small, medium and large, over the last couple of weeks. And what we found with the SME provisions is that they are nowhere close to meeting nonprofit needs, because just the shape and the economics of how a nonprofit sector works are so different. So what we're actually proposing is that this loan pool, $1 billion loan fund, underwritten by philanthropy and government, 10-year loan period, so not 3 years like the SME loan, but a 10-year loan period with a preferential interest rate somewhere between 1 and 1.75%. But importantly, having qualified intermediaries like an SVA partner with the banks to help organisations do the risk assessment and the capability assessment about whether they can carry a loan and whether they can then price in future loan payments into their grant applications to government or to philanthropy. And what that does is it encourages and allows philanthropy to use its balance sheet to try and free up more liquidity to get into nonprofits. And as I say, when we first started working on this idea a few weeks ago, our focus at that time was really very much about helping nonprofits through this period. But in talking to many of our members, what's emerging actually, which we already knew, but the sort of, the noise about this has been dampened down, is the ongoing requirement for nonprofits to have access to working capital to grow, to scale, and to innovate. And so we would see this as much about an ongoing development proposition for the sector as a how do we get through this period on life support. So look, that's just an example of some of the things we're working on. I will say that the sector and the other peak bodies, so Community Council of Australia, ACOS, ACVID, and a number of the others, we're all working very closely together. And just something that occurred to me as I was listening to Maree and Lisa as well, one of the things that I think has been really effective about this period is how quickly collaboration, real cooperation and collaboration has come together. And so the best of what we're seeing are pooled funds, collaborative efforts, shared information. I think that is very encouraging in terms of how people are working.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And just a couple of questions that came up there. One was about, is there any indication as to when a decision will be made about the minimum distribution for PAFs? And we don't know whether there'll be any changes. As Sarah said, Philanthropy Australia has a proposal around how to incentivise additional giving from private and public ancillary funds. But we don't have an indication of when that could come. And there was a comment made, I think, from David Knowles earlier about you know, how do we use the entire balance sheet of foundations? And I think that this is, you know, what Sarah said around sort of some of that, unlocking some of that capital in terms of loans and other sorts of things is an example of that. Now, I wanted to turn to you, Maree, and get your view about how do you reckon funders can lock in some of the changed approaches which have emerged in response to this crisis? Because in many respects, the statements that Philanthropy Australia put out and other organisations around the world have put out are really examples of what philanthropy should be ideally doing all the time. So how do we lock or try and maintain those changes going forward? And linked with that, how do we sort of use those changes to promote the NFP sector's longer term sustainability, which is another question that was also asked just before?
Thanks, Krystian. I think that is a great question. And to me, that goes to the other opportunity of this time, which I think thoughtful funders are thinking deeply about, which is how do we actually renegotiate the relationship between funders and fund seekers coming out of COVID? And the short answer to that is use this time to be having a dialogue and you know, a really robust discussion with if you're a fund seeker, with your funding partner, to say this is the type of funding that we have been needing and is important to us. So core operational funding, reducing red tape, reducing granting requirements should be what good philanthropic practice is about, which which you made that comment, Krystian. So I think there's definitely a conversation that's happening within philanthropy, but for that to be sustained, that needs to be a dialogue. It needs to be a two-way dialogue between philanthropic sector and the civil society sector to say, hey, these are great changes, let's maintain these. And so I sort of put the onus back on to all of us being able to work in partnership.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's already something that we're thinking about. Because I'd like to think, and there may be grantees on this call who might disagree, we don't have a lot of onerous processes and red tape for our funding. However, to the extent that kind of more untied capacity building, we've always done capacity building funding, but you know, can we do more of that with our grant making? And even our processes, you know, even the way that we consider funding on this, as I said, quarterly basis, you know, can we be a bit more responsive on an ongoing basis rather than, you know, in this fixed way? I do think, you know, not all funders are created equal. So there will be private foundations that will have different set of constraints, or perhaps fewer constraints to, say, a corporate foundation that have a different set of stakeholders that they report to and are beholden to. So I think that there's probably an attenuation based on the type of funder that you are, but I think it is a really important conversation and one I'm seeing from our peers in the United States in particular, and great to see that conversation starting in Australia too.
I think it might be one sort of positive of this crisis that it kind of provides an opportunity for the philanthropic sector to reflect on itself and how it is serving the community and how it can change its practices and evolve, like, because it's a shock to everyone and it's a bit of there's a bit of shock therapy for the sector as well. And just a very quick question for you, Lisa, as well. With the Macquarie Group Foundation funding, is it continuing to focus just on youth, or is the focus of the COVID funding broadened?
No, it's much broader. Yeah, it's not on our traditional youth focus. Yeah.
Okay. And now a question again for all of you, and it's a really good one, because many charities that might be primarily government funded, for example, or traditionally, or rely on trading income, they haven't engaged with philanthropy that much in the past, and they might be seeking to engage with philanthropy. But it's not that easy necessarily to know how to engage with philanthropy. So in terms of, you know, any suggestions or tips, and, you know, not about sort of necessarily how to write grant applications, but about tools and resources that are available for people within charities that are looking to engage with philanthropy for the first time. Sarah, might sort of turn to you, and Maree and Lisa as well afterwards, just for any suggestions that you might have for panelists, for people in the audience.
Sure. And I'll put a caveat on this though, because I'm not a fundraising expert. There will be people on this webinar that know way more about it than I do. But just one of the things that I think it's always really important to remember, particularly when we are in time of either rapid change or crisis, is to remember what we know. And you know, the core principles are as valid, if not more valid, in volatile times as they are in more kind of calmer times. And that is, people give to people, and people don't give if they're not asked and if they're not thanked. So, you know, there aren't any real shortcuts. It's about relationships. All of the philanthropists and donors I know have a very strong intellectual and or emotional connection to what they support. They absolutely care. They're not doing this because it's sort of on the side. They do it because it matters to them. And so that sense of relationship and trust and knowing your partners and who you're working with is really important. And there aren't that many shortcuts to be able to do that. On the other hand, we talked about some really pragmatic, immediate opportunities. The National Funding Platform is there for any registered DGR1 charity to use, and donors are searching it and looking at it. And there have been a number of collective responses where trusts and foundations have come together. So, you know, the Snow Foundation is on this webinar. There was an extraordinary collaborative initiative in Canberra that has put up more than $500,000 collectively to the Canberra community. Similar things are happening in Melbourne through the response that Maree talked about, and also the Lord Mayor's Foundation has a collaborative response. Fremantle Foundation in Perth is looking at building a collaborative response in Perth. And my understanding is that the Sydney Community Foundation is perhaps thinking of something similar in Sydney. So keep an eye out for those place-based collaborative responses for people that don't have the relationships and the access. Use the National Funding Platform. But at the end of the day, it's about relationships. And I just would also really, I'd go in a bit harder with what Maree said. I agree completely. I actually think nonprofits need to own a lot of this and have got to be a lot braver and a lot more upfront about asking for what they genuinely need, not necessarily what they think will be funded. Because unless the nonprofit sector can have those really honest, clear conversations and educate philanthropy about what's needed, then it's not going to happen. So I'd really like to see the leadership from those conversations around paying what it takes to come actually from nonprofits, and for us in the sector to stop the shorthand, or everything that you give will go straight to the cause, or, you know, we don't charge overheads on this. You know, as long as that rhetoric stays out there, that is how people will respond. So just, I guess, perhaps a bit provocative, but a shout out to all of the people doing the fundraising. Ask for what you really need, and be really upfront and much clearer about paying what it takes.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And Lisa, I might turn to you about sort of any guidance, sort of general guidance or advice.
Yeah, it's really tough. I know I've been on the nonprofit side too, and I think it is, you know, challenge, try and break into philanthropic organizations, and it's harder in a crisis, you know, whereas as we've been hearing, you know, organizations are doubling down on their existing grantees, you know, which is, again, the right thing to do. Hopefully increasing the funding, which is something, you know, people like us are doing. I do want to make a plug for the Australian Communities Foundation platform, actually, because I think that's a great way to get exposure, you know, if you've got the right sort of project to put on there, to get a public viewing of what you're doing. I mean, I've certainly looked at it, and I'm sure other funders like Macquarie are looking at things like that to get ideas. So.
That's fantastic. So the questions are coming, so I'll try and get through all of them as best as I can, and I'll combine a couple now. In terms of philanthropy, how do we balance sort of the need for immediate responses to the crisis versus longer term funding? Because there is only so much money available, even if we increase the amount of funding. And linked with that, is there a role for philanthropy trying to actually prevent such crises before? I mean, we know that Bill Gates in the United States sort of, a few years ago sort of said that, a massive flu pandemic is one of the biggest sort of threats that we face. And his foundation some foundations in the US kind of focus their funding on these very low probability but sort of high impact type events. So sort of two questions I've tried to link together, probably not very well, but Maree, perhaps turn to you about that tension between immediate response versus long-term funding.
Thanks, Krystian. Look, the answer to that one for me is both. There's not an either or here, that absolutely both are needed. And I think I haven't come across a foundation that doesn't recognise that. And that's where having different types of grant making approaches are really important. So that nimble, agile, get the money out the door quickly in response to immediate need. And then coming back to Lisa's comments about there's a really strong discussion happening in philanthropy about the fact that we have to make sure money is preserved for the length of this crisis and to support coming out the other end, which is just good grant making practice on the back of any crisis, and not forgetting that this is the second crisis in a row that philanthropies really responded to immediately. So we're coming off the back of the bushfires. So we've got this perfect storm of the bushfires, COVID-19, recognising that there'll be a drop in giving this year. Most foundations thinking, well, we're most of the way through this year, and even if we've already allocated our giving for this year, let's make some more available. But it is next financial year everyone's really concerned about, because that's when we'll see that perfect storm hitting the bottom line of foundations, and the need is likely to be so much greater for charities will have had, stretched the dollar as far as they can. So I think that's the discussion that we need to be having, which is how do we look at preserving every possible philanthropic dollar to get through the next 12 months. And I think some of the initiatives that Sarah was talking about, we really need to push hard, which is bringing government into the conversation and ensuring that we are not backing down on those requests for match funding in partnership with government, because that might be the way we get through 2021.
And Sarah, interested in your view about the sort of other sort of part of the question that I kind of probably not very well combined around how can philanthropy sort of, or should it play more of a role trying to prevent some of these kind of we'll sometimes refer to as black swan type crises that, low probability, high impact, although maybe pandemics aren't so low probability, we've just been kind of lucky. So do you think that there is a role for philanthropy there?
Look, the short answer is yes, and you're going to get a bit of a stream of consciousness blurb from me now, in that, I actually see philanthropy as a democratic behaviour. I see it as being an active citizen, part of being alive and living in your community. Is that I think we all have the responsibility and we all have an ability to some degree to actually build that community. And philanthropy is just one of the tools that we have in our toolkit to do that. So I actually think it is in everybody's power to a degree, and I see it as part of our democratic right and responsibility. And the point about philanthropy is that it is thoughtful and with intent and with design. So there's a difference between the spontaneous, generous giving that we do and philanthropy. And so that overlay of the thinking, the thought, the intent, the design is about strategy to whatever degree somebody uses that. It is about understanding and knowing and researching and exploring and listening to community about what's happening. So, at the biggest sense, well, yes, of course, it's philanthropy's role. It's everybody's role to think and interpret and to gauge. I think where philanthropy has the special power is it is the social risk capital. And so, the heartbreaking read some of the news in the Australian press around some of the early research that was done, not just into the COVID-19 virus, but some of the other strange new emergent viruses that a number of the research and health institutions were, pursuing their research agendas with, and then money got cut off, and so they didn't do that. And then here we are 5 or 6 years later, a global health pandemic. But I think re-understanding that the social risk element of philanthropy, that it can go out on a limb and do the unusual, the strange, the unsexy, the unpopular, the funding of things that may or may not go somewhere, that's its special power. So yeah, I think it is absolutely in philanthropy's bailiwick.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Now, there's a question about organisations that don't have DGR status, how they attract philanthropic funding, and it actually exposes a real problem we have with the taxation framework for charities in Australia. There are about 55,000 charities in Australia, only 27,000 of them have DGR status. Philanthropy Australia for years now has been banging the drum to expand access to DGR status, and will keep banging that drum until it happens. And why I say we is because I'm a policy advisor there as well, in addition to my role at CSI Swinburne. There are options such as auspicing, partnering with an organisation that has DGR status. You have to be careful. It has to all be above board, etc. It can only be done where that organisation's purposes are furthered by partnering with an organisation. But Maree, did you have any comments about that one?
Yeah, thanks, Krystian. I think it's a great question, and it's one that we get all the time. My first point would be, I think it's easy if you're making your first approach to philanthropy to just assume that the general rule is that philanthropy can only give to DGR1. That's how it appears on the surface, and certainly that is the case for many types of foundations, particularly private foundations. But I would encourage people to dig deeper, because there are certainly entities out there that can give to non-DGR1 organisations. So I'm thinking about trusts. I'm thinking about organisations like Australian Communities Foundation that have a non-tax deductible fund. And then the other thing I would say in relation to auspicing is that when we come across organisations that don't have DGR1, we work really hard if the need is there and it's important to get the money there anyway. So about 30% of the grants, and we make about 700 grants a year, about 30% of the grants we make are to non-DGR1 organisations, and we just go out and find those partners, and we actually make the connection to, as you said, further the purpose. So all I would say is don't be immediately discouraged. It just means that you have to work a bit harder to actually figure out how you get money to your organisation if you're not a DGR1.
Thanks so much, Maree. And we're sort of nearing the end now, but I'll just finish off with one final sort of question that's come up a couple of times. There is a view amongst some, or there is a question about whether the pressure on the not-for-profit sector in this crisis will lead to more consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, that sort of thing. I think that, mergers and acquisition can be right for some and not right for others. And when people say that there are too many charities in Australia, I respond by saying, well, what is the right number of charities in Australia? And we actually have a relatively low number of charities per head of population compared with many other countries. But I'm not sure, Lisa, Sarah, if you've got any sort of comments about sort of that, general kind of observations.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, because it just happens to be one of the little many buttons on my shoulder that gets pushed. I think that in all crises, there are opportunities for some form of learning and rebuilding better. So build back better. And in the Build Back Better portfolio for our charity and non-profit sector, there are going to be lessons that we are being slapped around the face with, that we are stupid if we don't pay attention to. So I actually think the conversation we had before about this false view that good giving doesn't cover operating or admin or overheads is whacking us on the butt really hard right now, because it is very clear that that was a very ridiculous and somewhat stupid proposition, because actually if we hadn't had decades of that kind of funding environment, then actually nonprofits might be in quite a different position in terms of retained earnings and investments capability and capacity than we are now. So we're being taught certain lessons now that I think we would be really foolish to ignore. One of the lessons, I think, is if we look at what is working incredibly well during this time of crisis, what is being shown is really a strong asset. The messages, to me anyway, seem to be it's local, it's bespoke, it's with and within and of community, it's equal access to shared resources, whether those are PEP masks or toilet paper, doesn't, the characteristics are around equity of access, local, bespoke, of community, and those values are ones that we've got to fight to protect, building this. So I have no doubt that there will be some consolidation and that there will be genuinely positive opportunities for amalgamations, different forms of partnerships, different forms of collaboration, and mergers as others. But I would be incredibly worried if the rhetoric kind of twisted a bit, and that somehow or other mergers and amalgamations became an objective of this, or became a poster child as something to achieve. So I think there will be opportunities, and they will be good ones. And so, amalgamations, mergers can be fantastic in scaling, sticky, better, longer term positive change. But the cart shouldn't come before the horse. And I think we need to really remember and treasure the characteristics that have proven to be the strongest assets during this period. And those are the assets that I think we need to try and replicate and scale as we try and build back better.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And we are on 1 o'clock now, so we're going to have to draw things to a close. But as you will see, I think we could probably keep this conversation going. But I really want to thank our wonderful panelists for your insights. Thank you so much. I've learnt a lot, and hopefully our audience has too. I want to thank Rhonda, Nick and Beck for all the work they've done putting this together. And I want to encourage you to visit the websites that have been talked about today. Visit the impact2020.online website for more information about other webinars and other topics. And for other information as well, the other websites that we've listed today in the chat function. We will be sending around a recording in a little while. And sorry to those that whose questions we weren't able to get to. We just ran out of time. But yeah, once again, thank you so much to everyone. Stay safe and stay in touch with CSI, and have a lovely day.